This is the Before You Read lecture on the book of Genesis. Really, the purpose of this lecture is to provide you with a broad orientation to the book of Genesis as a whole. Genesis, as you likely remember, is the first book of the Bible. We get the name Genesis from the Greek word meaning origin. We see this Greek word, for example, in Genesis 2:4, which speaks of the origin of heaven and earth. In Jewish tradition, the name of this book is Bereshit, which means in the beginning, and it derives from the first Hebrew word in the writing. Genesis is a book of beginnings. It traces the beginnings of the cosmos and of Earth's living creatures. It chronicles the first human beings and the advent of civilization, and it marks the founding events of a religious tradition. Genesis is also the foundation of a larger narrative that stretches from the creation of the world all the way to the establishment of the kingdom of Israel. As the narrative of Genesis progresses, there is a tension between the universal and the particular. God is the creator of the whole earth and of all of the earth's people as a result. But God's dealings are with a particular people, a long, extended, and fairly dysfunctional narrative about the people of Israel. This narrative establishes a basic theological premise of the Old Testament. Of all the nations of the world, God enters into a particular covenantal relationship with the people of Israel. What else then can I say about the book of Genesis by way of orientation? One place to start is with the question of authorship. Traditional authorship, tradition maintains that Moses is the author of Genesis. Now, this is a part of a larger tradition that says Moses not only wrote Genesis, but wrote the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible known as the Pentateuch. Now, this is complicated by some of the textual details themselves. For example, Moses or Genesis describes events that happened hundreds of years before Moses lived, and yet they're written from a narratival perspective that suggests some familiarity or proximity to those events. On the other hand, the Pentateuch ends with narrating Moses' death. So how could he have been the author of a text that narrates his own death, right? So modern scholarship has come up with a more complicated or nuanced understanding of authorship when it comes to the Pentateuch and to the book of Genesis. So scholars pay attention to the way in which the text of Genesis has been written, and they noticed certain repetitions or divergences in the narrative. And this leads them to suggest that Genesis is actually a composite work. That is, it is a combination of several works or authors or traditions. One prominent scholarly understanding of this, known as the documentary hypothesis, identifies 3 documents or sources that have been embedded in the narrative of Genesis. So scholars attend to the writing style, the particular perspectives or emphases, and the names that the narratives use for God to distinguish these 3 sources. Now, why does this matter to you who might be watching this lecture? Well, I'm not expecting you to come out with a paper and pen and sort of identify where one tradition is at work and another tradition is at work. But it can have an explanatory function when you encounter some rough edges in the narrative, perhaps some things that don't make sense or even stand in tension or contradiction to what preceded or follows in the narrative. This is simply one way of explaining those differences, and of course it doesn't explain all of them. The next thing that I might want to say about orientation to Genesis concerns history. And really, when we are reading Genesis, we need to keep 2 historical horizons in mind. The first is the times about which the authors wrote. So Genesis tells the story about things that happened ages ago, even before history was a thing. And so we want to keep that horizon in mind. But as the New Interpreter's Study Bible points out, quote, no evidence of Genesis is available to place the events of Genesis into a precise historical context or to demonstrate that they happened as narrated. So whether or not Genesis claims to be history in a modern sense of the word is up for debate. It's a matter of practical debate and scholarly debate. But perhaps we are asking the wrong questions if we ask, did this really happen? Or did it really happen in this way? But more on that later. The second historical horizon that we need to keep in mind, we can be a little bit more confident about. And this is the horizon, the historical horizon of the time period in which the authors wrote. So we see things that come through the narrative that represent a life several hundred years later than the period in which they're describing. So we see things about life on the ground in the ancient Near Eastern world, things like religious or cultural, social, or even political realities that are from a time much later than the period that they're describing. And so sometimes these historical horizons intersect and they sort of collide even. And so we want to be aware of that as we read the book of Genesis. The final thing to say by way of orientation about the book of Genesis is that it really is a book of explanations. Like other foundation or foundational narratives, the book of Genesis explains the cause or reason for certain things. These narratives explain why things are the way they are, right? In Genesis, we see these sorts of explanations about why the seventh day of the week is a day of rest in Jewish tradition. We learn about why tilling the land in childbirth are such difficult, even painful experiences. And we learn about why the lifespan of humans is limited to the number of years that it is. Often these explanations of why things are the way they are more than simply descriptive. They often carry with them the sense that things ought to be this way, and thus they have a normative function. Another sort of orienting piece to the book of Genesis would be to provide an outline. And I'm providing you with an outline that is a simple 4-part outline. And there are as many outlines of Genesis as there are interpreters of Genesis. But I think that this will help us as we move through the book of Genesis. So the first part of Genesis, chapters 1 through 10, is what I would call the primeval age. This is the part of Genesis that concerns the very earliest periods in history. It concerns the creation of the world and humanity, the firstborn humans of the earth, the rise of civilizations, and the story of Noah and the flood. The second part, in chapters 11 through 24, really considers sort of civilization and the story of Abraham and Sarah. The narrative focuses on Abraham, his wife Sarah, and his concubine Hagar. These characters are the originators of what will become the people of Israel. God makes a special relationship or a special covenant, a special agreement with Abraham, and this is signified by the practice of male circumcision. The third part of the narrative, chapters 25 through 36, is about Jacob and his children. Here the focus of the narrative continues to narrow in these chapters. We trace the story of Abraham's son Isaac to the feuding of Isaac's sons Jacob and Esau. Eventually, Jacob is renamed Israel, and the final chapters in this section of Genesis recount the stories of Israel's 12 sons, who later become known as the 12 tribes of Israel. The final section of Genesis can be described as Joseph and the children of Israel in Egypt, and it spans chapters 37 to 45. A distinguishing feature of this portion of Genesis is its focus on Joseph, one of Israel's sons who is sold into slavery by his brothers. Eventually, Joseph rises to a place of prominence in the Egyptian king's court, and he saves his family from starvation during a famine. Eventually, the whole family of Israel relocates to Egypt, setting the stage for the narrative found in the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus. As you read Genesis, pay particular attention to what the stories tell us about the narrative of the world, about humanity and about human relationships, and of course about God. Read carefully. Notice gaps in the narrative, like the sudden entrance of characters or even entire people groups that have previously been unmentioned. And attend to that tension that I mentioned earlier between the universal and the particular. Genesis is at once a very strange and familiar book. Many have been taught the stories of Genesis from childhood with felt cutouts and coloring sheets. But when we sit down to read the book of Genesis, some parts of the narrative seem more unfamiliar, even unsettling. So take it all in as you read this book of beginnings.